This episode of Historians at the Movies podcast is brought to you by our patreon.com subscribers. If you'd like to help support Historians at the Movies, you can do so by going to patreon.com/historians at the movies. Now on with the show. Can good food be sinful? What are the historic links between delicious food and sexuality? Where do waitresses come from? And exactly who should we be following on social media? Hey everybody, this is Jason Herbert. I am the host and creator of Historians at the Movies podcast, where every single week we are talking about movies and the histories behind them. And this week we are talking about Eat, Pray, Love with Julia Roberts. And our guest this week is the amazing Rachel Hope Cleves. She is the author of the brand new book, Lustful Appetites, An Intimate History of Good Food and Wicked Sex. And never in the history of this podcast, in the 2+ years that we've been doing this, have we had to censor ourselves so many times as we did in today's discussion. Rachel's book talks so much about maybe the things we take for granted, the edible trappings of flirtation and infatuation, chocolate-covered strawberries and romance, or oysters on the half shell and desire, eggplant emoji, and just a suggestive wink. Why does it feel so natural for us to link food and sexual pleasure? Guys, this is such a great conversation that you're going to have and you're listening to today, talking about Eat, Pray, Love, but talking about food tourism, American perceptions of food, how restaurants have changed, how conceptions of food have changed over time. And it's an amazing book for you to read. I cannot wait for you to listen to this conversation. I can't wait for you to hear us talk about all these different things. And I can't wait for you to read this book. So sit back and relax, because Eat, Pray, Love is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. See, I'm so glad you were like, let's not use all the good words before we start recording just now, because I felt like that was going to happen. So I am so excited to talk to you about this movie and your work. But before we do so, do you want to introduce yourself and like what you're doing here?
Well, I'm super excited to be here. I'm Rachel Hope Cleves. I'm a professor of history at the University of Victoria, and I mostly focus on the history of sexuality, and in this book on the history of food and sex.
Okay, so I have to tell you, as I was reading through the book, and people who have been listening to the pod will know this, I've been posting on social media because I've just been like, oh no. Like when I would read the book, I'm like, oh, that makes sense. Wait, broth and brothel. I just don't, like, how was I taking all of this for granted this whole time about these linkages between sexuality and food? And like, you know, we think about this, about this, but like the way that you spell this out, this is going to be a really fun book and a really fun conversation. I want to ask you, like, how did you come to write this book? Oh, we should probably introduce the name of the book, Lustful Appetites, An Intimate History of Good Food and Wicked Sex. What was the impetus between writing this?
So this book emerged out of a sabbatical year I spent in Paris in 2013 to 2014. So this was a 10-year book. And at that time, I had just finished work on my second book, Charity and Sylvia, Same-Sex Marriage in Early America, which came out in 2014. And my first book had been about American reactions to the violence of the French Revolution. So I'd written this very heavy book on death, you know, and terror. And then I had written this very romantic book about sex and love. And then I thought, you know what, I'm going to write a third book on food, and then I'll have covered like all the bases of human experience. I'll have done death, sex, and food. So that was my idea going into this sabbatical year in Paris. And I started reading a lot of accounts of Americans learning how to cook in Paris. And I kind of had like a microhistory idea in mind, and I would do 18th century to the present day. But as I started going into the sources, it's like there was so much sex in them. And I don't know if that's because I still had the sort of scope of being a historian of sexuality from having just completed Charity and Sylvia, or because I am just a person who's always attuned to sexuality, which might explain a lot about my career. But whatever it was like the sources were just like filled with sex. And I realized that no one had written about that. Like, we naturalized this connection between food and sex, but it's really not been a subject of historical inquiry. So I started working on this project. I got sidelined along the way by one of the characters who pops up briefly in this book, Norman Douglas, and I wrote a book about him. And then I came back to this project.
I love that was the case. Like, it feels like this book was kind of calling you to write it. I love the fact that you have a trilogy now. It's very movie-esque of you, Rachel.
Exactly.
I don't know what you're going to do with the next franchise that you'll have to start off on. I have to ask you, do you cook?
I do cook. Although for most of the years of my adult life, my ex-husband did all the cooking. So when I was a teenager, I got very into cooking and I actually thought about becoming a chef. Not in any serious way. It was just like a fantasy I had as a teenager. And I had a fantasy about like the restaurant I wanted to have. I grew up in New York City, so I grew up in a food culture. And I got advice from the father of a friend of mine who was like, Rachel, you can't do that because you're just going to be bored. Like you need something that will stimulate your brain. And like, ultimately, this is not going to work for you. And I think he was right. So I let that fantasy go by the wayside, but I was still very engaged in cooking and food. And when I met my husband, he was really into those things as well. And it was a bond we shared. And then I went to graduate school and I had 2 children and was writing a dissertation. And at that point, I was like, you do the cooking. So full-time job, raising 2 kids. And so then for about, 20 years, my ex-husband, who's a wonderful cook, did all of the shopping and all of the cooking. And I was just extremely well fed for a couple of decades, about which I have no complaint. But I did get separated about 1.5 years ago. And so now I have to cook for myself again. And I've been enjoying returning to that. And my kids are grown and out of the house. And so it's like a return to some of the things that, like creative endeavors of my youth.
No, I find that it's a thing that I've also been doing. When I first moved to Florida, I was 22. I was actually going to go to Florida Culinary Institute. I was going to be a chef. I love to cook. And a running joke between my ex-wife and I, who are great friends, if she sees, like, we'll be talking, she's like, are you cooking? She's like, how bad of a day was it? Because the running joke is like, if I've had a rough day,
Mm-hmm.
I'm in the kitchen with like a bottle of wine, like music playing, and I'm cooking I'm just in my little happy place. And one of my great complaints about my current apartment here is like the kitchen kind of isn't great. It's got that old style where there's not a lot of room, and I'm a messy cook, Rachel. I need to explore the space. So
The food needs to explore the space.
I can't be I want to talk to you about social media a little later. I can't be a TikTok influencer or anything like that because I don't have the room to set up all the stuff. I mean, God knows I've got the ego for it, but I don't have the room.
I see your food pictures on social media and they do look excellent. And it's probably not a surprise to you that I am pretty judgy, like about food. So I have observed your technique and I have observed that it is excellent. And I am sure your food is really good.
Oh, thank you. I used to be like the barbecue guy when I was living in Florida because I had so much more room and it was always barbecue weather. This morning it was -7 and it was barely let the dog out the door weather this morning where I just absolutely not. I'm not doing anything. All right. Beyond Cooking with Jason and Rachel, which is our next podcast. Actually, you're starting. It's actually your next book is a podcast with me where we just talk about food and everybody else. Let's talk about this movie, Eat, Pray, Love. You and I started talking. I'd seen that you were going to do this. You were writing this book, and it was like I was kind of waiting. I was like, when's it coming out? You want to come on the pod? It's like, what movie do we do? You had read the book, but you had never seen.
No, I never read the book until you and I agreed
Oh,
to do the
okay.
movie. And then because I'm a nerd, I wanted to read the book first, right?
Okay.
So then I read the book and then I watched the movie last night.
Okay. All right. First thoughts of the movie itself.
Well, so and I watched it with a friend of mine who also has recently gone through a separation. And so we're both in this sort of like, midlife, like, who am I? Where am I? And like, what is my purpose in life? And so we talked about it as we watched it. Like we were in separate houses, but we were like, did a co-watch and then we paused
Right.
after each
I've heard of this
section.
idea.
Yeah. So I ended up thinking a lot about like how it differed from the book, which is probably like not germane to this podcast, like what it had in common and what it and how it diverged. But I have both like sympathy with the character and sympathy with the movie and points of irritation. I mean, I think that it's very easy to dismiss the story of like a privileged white woman's journey of self-exploration, right? And like I get the rap. On the other hand, like as a middle-aged white woman of moderate privilege, like obviously like these questions are important to me, like who am I, where am I, what do I want, how do I be a person in the world, not necessarily like vested in my romantic relationship, right? So I related to a lot of those things. How do I um, orient my feelings around my body and my appetites and my creative life and my spiritual life and all of those things. And I appreciate the fact in both the book and the movie that I think Liz Gilbert is like, she's an imperfect character, right? Like she's kind of like clueless about her, she's a solipsistic, she's like, but she comes off that way, like she depicts herself that way in the book, and I think Julia Roberts captures it in the movie. She like, so I always enjoy fiction and memoir and history about imperfect people and imperfect women in particular, because our culture has such a lack of sympathy with imperfect women. There's so much hostility, like, and so like I kind of appreciate that she has like there are things that are unlikable about her and then things that are deeply likable about her.
Yeah, I think that gets to the idea of the humanity of her as a person, the humanity of any person, which is that, I look at myself, I'm like, I'm a hot mess and I know it, right? I mean, this is like, there are parts where like, yeah, I'm good dad and I do all the stuff. And then I'm a grumpy a-hole when it comes to the Pueblo, Colorado food scene. I know this,
But I thought you reviewed Subway well, and I have to tell you that Subway is my absolute most hated fast. I can't like because walking like I won't. And I'm not eating any fast food really, but like the problem with Subway is that it pumps out the smell of its like autolyzer that it uses to fast bake its breads, and I find the smell of it so repellent, and so I resent Subway because just walking by it makes me.
Well, can I tell you? Can I tell you that now all of my reviews have 5 stars? I was guilted into this because I might give a thing 5 stars, and then so my boss, at the Forest Service, actually reads my restaurant reviews. He's like, Jason, why are you killing everyone here? And I'm like, he's like, because I think really your reviews are a critique of Pueblo. I was like, that is exactly it, sir. And he listens to the pod, so. How am I employed still?
Love Jim. It can't have won you friends, those reviews.
Do I want to be friends? I don't know. Either way, but I like if someone's just scrolling, I don't want to hurt a small business. At the same time, I want to have a little fun, and I consider it a creative writing exercise. So it's not hurting their algorithm if I just say, "Hey, okay, the restaurant's hit and miss, but Pueblo itself is awful." And here's me throwing in, allusions to Dante's Inferno. Look how creative I am. So
I think you can collect them eventually.
A friend of mine wants me to do that I went to high school with, and I think he just wants to get me shot. So
hopefully not. I'll knock on wood.
Well, we'll see. Maybe it'll be a coffee table book at Barnes and Noble one day. So, but I do get your point here, right? Like, are you really supposed to hold it? There's this idea is like, on the outside, Liz is setting off to Italy. Poor thing, she had to go spend a couple months in Italy eating all the food, and she goes around like it's not to many places in Italy, and then she's got to go to India, and then she's got to go to Bali. Oh no, how awful! at the same time, how many of us have not been through a breakup where it's just devastated us, whether it's a divorce or just whatever, right? And felt like you need to go find yourself again.
Or maybe you need to find yourself and then you'll get to the divorce, which I think is what happens with her at
Yeah.
some level, right? But yeah, no, it's deeply relatable and it matters enormously. And I love the quotation they use at the beginning of the movie, which was one of the quotations that jumped out at me from the reading, where she's talking about this friend of hers who has been called on to do social work with refugees from the Cambodian genocide, right? And they're coming to her and then talking. And this friend of hers is like, what can I possibly do for these people who've been through all of this, like just these unbelievable horrors, and like, what do I possibly know? And then they come to her and are like, well, I had this problem where like I fell in love with this guy on the boat, but then we were separated in different refugee camps, and now he's married to my cousin, but he wants to get back together with me. And like, it is, I mean, there is a deeply shared human commonality that we, across time and place, many of us can be very self-obsessive about our romantic relationships.
Yeah, on the outside, you're going, oh, but you're going through a genocide. I know, but also my girlfriend is dating my cousin now. Don't you understand the problems at hand here?
Yeah.
Are there other scenes when you were watching the film that were catching to you that you felt? Joanne Freeman, when she was on the podcast once, she calls this her codfish moment, because we were doing the Benjamin Franklin series on Apple, and they were talking about the codfish fishery off the coast of New England. And Joanne's just dying about codfish. She's like, it's my codfish moment. I understand this thing. So did you find any scenes in this particular film that were like, you felt like they were really, aside from the boat people scene, like that were really speaking to you? They're like, oh, I get this. This is really...
Yeah. Oh, totally.
Okay, dive in. Go for it.
The scene where Julia Roberts is wearing like beautiful silky lingerie and like sitting on the floor of her Rome apartment, bathed in Roman light, and treating herself to a feast of asparagus, soft-boiled egg, silky smoked salmon while doing nothing. But she kind of has like the newspaper there, like 100%. I was like, that. Could I put myself in her position? Absolutely. And it would bring me tremendous joy.
I feel like that same thing for me, only it's Mickey Mouse PJs. So just sitting there with a charcuterie board, I'm good to go.
I love the sensual indulgence of, she's wearing a textile that is like smooth and silky and feels good and makes her feel like sexy, right? And she's enjoying this one. Yay.
Yeah, when you're going through the stuff, it's good enough to be like, this feels good. I'm going to go with this right now, right? So I totally get it. I want to ask you a little bit about the book, and I'm going to try to see if I can't tie the story, Liz's story, a little bit to your book as well, because we see Liz going all over the world. Your book covers a lot of territory in time and space, and
yes.
One of the things as I'm reading, I'm like, well, she's gonna keep going. She's gonna go. All right, cool. Let's go. Going all the way from what early 19th century all the way to our present day
18th century.
18th century. Excuse me. Yeah. All the way to our present day here. Can we talk first and foremost, because I think listeners in here maybe take for granted what people thought about food in during the time period. Can we talk a little bit about like how these puritanical conceptions about what food is and how a person is supposed to dine and what food means? Like, what's the foundations of American food, I guess, is the very simple question I'm trying to ask you.
Great question. So in the book, I make this argument about the emergence of what I call an alimentary sexual discourse. It's not a jargony book, but that is my sort of framework term for a set of ideas about the association between food and sex that really predominate among Anglo-Americans from the late 18th century to the end of the 20th century. And then in the epilogue, I talk about the 21st century. And so what I argue is that there's this emergent linking between enjoyable food, like hedonic food, pleasure-oriented eating, and illicit sexuality that rises with the invention of the restaurant in Paris in the late 18th century, expands as Anglophones like American and British visitors to Paris encounter the restaurant and then bring it back home to Britain and the United States, which are the primary spaces I'm talking about. It takes shape in the 19th century because the restaurant becomes a space for sex work in all of these locations, and it leads to this rising Victorian rejection of indulgence in good food and this set of beliefs that, especially for women, to show pleasure in eating indicated that you had a disreputable appetite for sexual enjoyment, and that this sort of Victorian discourse creates the conditions for what Foucault would call a counter discourse. Like, if to be a good and respectable person, you need to subordinate your alimentary appetites to show that you're sexually respectable. Then if you want to have a counter identity, if you want to embrace sexual disreputability, a great way to do that is to indulge at the table. So we get this emergence in the late 19th century of a link between being a sexual outlaw and enjoying pleasurable eating, rich foods, luxurious foods, French foods, restaurants. And so then in the 20th century, the book talks about this association between like non-normative sexualities, same-sex desire, queer desire, promiscuity, and indulgence in good food. And then I close the arc in the 1980s with the rise of the foodie, which I argue is basically like a commodified heterosexual reclaiming of indulgence in good food as like sexually reputable. So if in the 1950s and 60s, to be a man and to be a gourmet was to be marked as gay, right? To be marked as queer. In the 1980s, you get the emergence of this foodie culture, which really pitches, and I talk about like an article in Forbes magazine, for example, it really pitches towards men of income. Like, you can be masculine, you can be straight, and you can be a foodie, who buys a pasta maker, like buys truffle oil or like whatever the newest gadget is, the sous vide machine, whatever. And it won't have to challenge your gender or your sexuality. You could be like a normative and like cisnormative and heterosexual. So that's sort of I see the rise of the foodie as sort of like putting a close on this narrative arc, although there's big exceptions. And I think women especially still struggle with having to subordinate their appetites in order to present as sexually respectable within a heterosexual context. And then I talk at the very end of the book in the epilogue about what I see as like our new discourse today, which is a shift from what I jokingly called, what I wanted the title of the book to be, Good Food, Bad Sex, to, thank you for laughing. I like that title. So go from good food, bad sex to bad food, good sex, which is, I think nowadays there's a new dominant discourse that in order to have good sex, which is now not moral sex, but like pleasurable sex, in order to have good sex, you have to manage and control your alimentary appetites, and you should eat non-hedonic foods like kale and chickpea, and just to be clear, I love kale and I love chickpeas. I'm totally omnivorous. So no offense to kale and chickpeas, but they're not like sensuous, indulgent foods in the way that like cream and oysters are, right? And so now I think we have this discourse that like, if you want to have good sex, you have to have a hard fit body. And if you want to have a hard fit body, you've got to restrict your calories. And so you better be eating pure food or clean food. I put those things in quotes because I don't believe in them as, objective realities. You have to eat pure, clean food. And then, I literally quote from cookbooks in the epilogue that are like, if you want to have an erection, better have pure food, better have clean food, better cut out those carbs, better cut out that sugar. If you want to have a sex drive or a libido, you better eat clean and eat pure. And if you want people to fuck you, you better eat clean and eat pure. I'm sorry, are curse words so loud?
We are absolutely allowed to curse on this podcast. Actually, so that brings up, so you're speaking to this, and there's this wonderful line between Liz and Sophie as they've traveled up to Naples,
Mhm.
And she's like, I can't eat anymore. Sophie says, I can't eat anymore. I put on 10 pounds. And of course, Liz is saying, has any man, once you started undressing yourself, has any man ever told you no?
Not just that. Has any man been, she's saying, like, has anyone ever been disappointed? Have you ever taken off your clothes, right? And they've been like, of course, one of the problems with this movie is this conversation is happening between two, like, normatively gorgeous,
Yes, sure.
slim bodied white women, right? Like, neither of them are in any way challenging any sort of social norms about what we consider to be sexually attractive. So just with that caveat, but yeah, she says exactly that, right? Like, has anyone ever been, because the Sophie is complaining about her muffin top, and Julia Roberts' character Liz says, like, has any man ever, expressed any sort of disappointment when you've taken off your clothes? Or he's just been like, I'm the luckiest man in the world. I've got a naked woman right here in front of me.
There's so much links here whenever I start to think about, say, early American Republic and these relationships, say in this era, like differing gender norms between the ways in which men and women can approach food as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, the strongest anathema in Victorian culture, like in the 19th century, is on women's expression of their appetites. But that doesn't mean it doesn't impact men's expression of their appetites as well. And like Grahamist, so Sylvester Graham's, dietary prescriptions from which we derive like the graham cracker, but this advocacy for vegetarianism and temperance as means of, and the eating of brown bread in the 1830s as a means of controlling the sexual appetites, like that's very much directed at men, right? It's also directed at women, but Graham is very concerned with the way that young men's indulgence in good food will lead them to sexual appetites, which will then destroy them morally and physically.
Yeah. So lay off the duck fat. Lay off.
No
You can't.
meat,
You
no
can.
meat for a gram at
Oh.
least.
Oh man, that's awful. I want to ask you about the restaurant, because this is another thing I've always taken for granted. The idea of where the restaurant
Yes.
comes from. Okay, so can you lay this out for? I don't want to spoil the entire book because people should absolutely be reading this thing because it's so good. They should devour the book. All right, Rachel. Where does the restaurant come from, and how does this change American? How does this idea of a restaurant changing American ideas towards food?
So the restaurant is so ubiquitous in contemporary culture, it really is hard to fathom that it wasn't, that it's a recent invention, and that
God,
it
it would be
is.
so much older.
No, no. So it is the case that over history, people have needed to buy food when they are not at home. So there have been, and then you can find like in Herculaneum or Pompeii, right? Like ancient food stalls. And there's like outside of the Western world, there's evidence of restaurant culture in China in like the 1200s. So it's not that there's no history of buying food outside of the home prior to modern times. But up through the 18th century in Europe and colonial America, which is where I start my story, where I focus on, there are no such things as restaurants. You can get what's called a table d'hote, which is like the board associated in the room and board at an inn. And if you like are traveling, you need to eat when you're traveling, you check in, and there's going to be a common table. You pay for it as, part of the cost of staying at an inn or a tavern, and everybody's going to sit around the same table. The meal is at a certain time. It's like 6 p.m. or whatever it is. And there's going to be common platters of food, and they're passed around. And all you ever hear in, like travelers' accounts are complaints. Like the food is bad. It's not about the food. Like the food is just to feed you, because you have to eat, but the innkeeper is going to stint on that. It's going to be gristly. It's going to be oily. There's not enough. If you're not sitting close to where the food is, you might be out of luck by the time the platter comes to you and it's just gravy and there's no meat left in it. So it's not a culinary focused experience. And what happens is in late 18th century France, a new type of eatery emerges, and that is, it becomes called a restaurant, but it is named that because initially it's a place that serves a sort of restorative broth. So the broth is the restaurant in French. It is restoring, and it is intended for, these like, this is the 18th century age of sensibility. So it's these like these aristocratic or elite men who are just like, fainting away and need to be restored and need to have their sexual vigor restored. And so the restoring broth is also like an erection booster. And so the restaurant from the beginning is like associated with like reinvigorating your virility or your sexual energies. And there's these private rooms. So these places that serve this restoring broth do so in this new milieu where you have private tables and you can come in at any time and you are priced per item you buy. And the restaurateurs who are serving restaurants start serving like other kind of delicate foods. And in the French Revolution and in the breakdown of the Ancien Regime guild system, there is suddenly a new range of possibility in Paris for opening up these sorts of eateries. Like before, there had been a guild, the Traiteur Guild, which controlled like who and where hot food could be served. But this breaks down with the French Revolution, and you get the explosion of these new restaurants. And so in the late 1700s, like 1790s and the early 1800s, all of a sudden you get these restaurants that now look like what we would expect. They are big rooms. They are like luxuriously decorated. They might have like gas lamps and mirrors. And so they appeal to all the senses, your oral senses, your, sight and smell. They're often overseen by women who are like provocatively dressed, who are serving as cashiers or dames de comptoir. The waiters are men. You get a menu and you can order items that are priced individually. So you come in at any time. You don't have to sit down at 6. You get your own table. So it's private, but it's public. You're in a public space. And the focus is on the food, right? So you get these restaurants in like 1800, which have 20-page menus. They're like the Cheesecake Factory of the day, right? There's like so many different sauces and permutations and drinks and all the rest. So that's the origin of the restaurant. It does not spread outside of Paris for a long time. Like there are sources from London in the 1870s. There's a atlas of London published by Charles Dickens's son, where he's like, there's still no restaurants here. There's like one restaurant. And it takes the first restaurant, a lot of people say in the States, the first real restaurant is Delmonico's in New York City. And like by the 1840s, New York City is becoming a restaurant culture. And by like 1850s, San Francisco is definitely a restaurant culture. So mid 19th century, we get the rise of real modern restaurants in the US, but it takes a long time.
Were you able to, in the process of researching and writing this book, to like go to any of these historic establishments and like spend your time? I'm a big believer in experiential history. The idea that you've got to go and
Me too.
You can't write from an office.
To Paris, obviously.
Right? And
New York, San Francisco, and New Orleans all required visits.
Thank you for saying all of these things, because you just mentioned, well, I'm not a big fan of New York, but like San Francisco and New Orleans, those are my town, and Chicago, but that's for different reasons. I go to Chicago, I come out weighing 62 pounds more than I did.
What are you eating in Chicago?
They call it pizza there, but it's a casserole.
No,
it's a lie. It's just nothing.
Brooklyn girl. I did live outside Chicago for 4 years, and I never became a fan of Chicago pizza.
Okay, good. We'll see if we can get this podcast sponsored by Ray's at some point in time.
For me all the way, and I have been to the restaurant in Naples that Julia Roberts or Liz and Sophie eat at in that scene.
Okay, can you tell us about that restaurant then?
It's so good. I love Naples. I've been to Naples twice, and the pizza, it is in fact super dangerous, and you do have to be really careful not to be mugged. So I say this as somebody who grew up in New York City in the 1980s. Like, I know my way around mugging. I have been the victim of multiple muggings. I was in Naples for like an hour, and I was with my daughter, and I saw a guy like beelining at me, and I had to like grab my daughter's hand and like book it. Like,
do you have a spidey sense?
Yeah, totally. it's hard to grow up in Brooklyn in the 80s without like some spidey sense of when someone's about to assault you. So yes.
Oh,
So
okay.
Naples is in fact dangerous,
Awesome.
but it's an amazing
Lovely.
city. And
Everyone go to Naples.
the pizza is brilliant. You just have to be like self-aware in Naples about where your bag is in relation to your body and who's going by you on a Vespa, and just like use a little street sense. But I mean, I love it. Like it's a great city. It's sort of a crumbling ruin, and I haven't been there since maybe 2018. And I read an article just recently about it is a city that has been transformed by like Instagram and.
I have to imagine, right? And this is something I want to talk about a little bit later on about this, like this food tourism, because hell, we can talk about it now because that's very much an aspect of what Liz, Julia Roberts' character, goes to do in order to find her place in the world, find her place in herself, or whatever. Did you find this in the record where people are like thinking about food and themselves, or is this more of a modern day phenomenon where people are really kind of linking their own self identity to the foods they eat and the places they go?
Oh, I think it is historic. Yeah, no, I think it's much older than today. And historians of food would argue that food, while we can think of it as something like biological, we all have to eat in order to live. Can't live without eating. All the breatharians would say otherwise, but most of us accept that food is necessary for sustaining human life. That nonetheless, like it is like the big cultural identity former, right? Like how we eat and what we eat is how we like construct sense of individual identity, communal identity, religious identity, national identity. So yes, I think people have thought about those connections for a long time, and food is an important part of commercial tourism from the rise of commercial tourism. So one of the big source bases I use in those early chapters where I'm talking about American reactions and British reactions to the French restaurant are travelogues. So in the 1820s or earlier, like all throughout the 19th century, first half of the 19th century, privileged travelers are going to Paris, often on like health tours. It's often people with tuberculosis who are like, have been advised to travel by their doctors. Sometimes it's medical students or art students who go to Paris. But there's a huge genre of English language travelogues, like my like letters from Europe. And they spend great length about like what the restaurants in Paris are like. It is just like a formulaic element of the genre. Like I went to the restaurant in Paris and these are ones I went to and this is what I ate and this is what the room looked like and this is what, So yes, I think that like the construction of an identity around travel and what you eat while you're traveling is a part of the history of tourism from at least from the Grand Tour on, and very common in the 19th and 20th centuries.
All right. Well, you talk about this idea of consumption and people going to Europe and eating all these foods and things like that, main course, dessert. Let's talk about what's not on the menu here. I want to talk about what the linkages between restaurants and sex workers, which was, again, a thing that as I'm opening, I'm going, oh my, I did not. All right, this is changing.
Yes.
When I go into Wendy's now. So
this has
can you
changed.
talk a little bit? Can you talk a little bit about that? About how sex workers and restaurants are worked? Like, what's going on here?
So when the restaurant emerges in late 18th century Paris, and as it flourishes in the first half of the 19th century, it's highly associated with sex work. And that takes several forms. A lot of the high-end restaurants have what are called cabinet particulier, which are private rooms, and they are set up with typically a couch or a divan and a table and a couple of chairs. And they would have their own menus, often about twice the price of the main public room, and sometimes kind of like specialized menus. And so these were rooms which were used for multiple functions, but a primary function of these rooms was for men to meet with women who were not their wives, who may have been their mistresses, but often were sex workers. So they would go into this room and they would order an elaborate meal, and then they would like engage in, sexual encounters with their guest on the divan. And you have, like I quote from the Larousse dictionary, right, about how like in the restaurant, it's the the sofa that's the plot of de resistance, right? Like this is the main thing on the menu is this the opportunity to have a sexual encounter. And I also talk a little bit in the room about how these are also places that are associated with sexual assault and sexual coercion. The doors can be locked from the inside, and the waiters who service them are notoriously circumspect, right? They won't come in without knocking first, and they hear nothing. So, like, if you did lure someone into this room and then assault them, this gave you a private space to assault a person. I mean, they're not like only about assault; they're also largely about a trade in sex, and they figure really widely in like operas and novels and poetry and humor of the time. They're like well known. And when the restaurant spreads outside of Paris, the high-end French restaurants in cities like London and San Francisco and New York often have cabinet particulier, often have private rooms, and are often the sites for men to meet with sex workers. There are also so like one of the wonders of the French language in the first half of the 19th century are like how many synonyms there are for sex workers. Like I found these lists where you get like 100 different words for sex workers. Like a pieuse is like someone who walks on the streets, and so there's a variety of a sex worker called a soupeuse, and these were basically women who hung out around restaurants and solicited men. So men would like bring them into the restaurant, or maybe they'd already be in the restaurant, and they would eat together. The woman would sometimes like get a cut of the meal, and then that would be sometimes he would take her into a private room. They'd like be hanging out outside the restaurant, available to go into a private room. Or sometimes it would be sort of like a first step in a date, which culminated back in her apartment or something like that. So I read a lot about like a lot of primary sources about like who were the supas and what were their various ways of extracting money from men's pockets, which were various. There's all sorts of scams that they're associated with and kickback schemes. And that continues right into the 20th century, right? Like, so, and it continues today. So in the 20th century, we get B-girls. This is drink soliciting and not food soliciting necessarily, but where you get a cut of women who hung out in bars in the mid 20th century and would solicit men to buy them drinks, and then the bar would serve them weak drinks, and then they would get a kickback on every drink that a man bought for them. And that's still absolutely a 21st century practice. Like that's how how women in strip bars make money.
And now I have to tell you, this is, so I moved to West Palm Beach when I was 22 years old, right? And I was selling cars. And there, as I recall, there was a place called Rachel's, which was a high-end strip club. But it was a thing there where you go there. Oh my gosh, I didn't think about that. I'm so sorry. But it was known for having like extremely high-end food.
Yes.
Along with other ways to quench one's appetite.
Yes.
As well, right? And as I'm reading this going, oh my gosh.
It's a long tradition.
It's the most American thing one can do. Now, does this spread to the United States as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So, the presence of so there's all sorts of sort of mixed, ways in which the history of sex work and the history of good food and hedonic eating connect. But like brothels with elaborate like brothel menus are common in the 19th century. So like some of the nicest restaurants you could probably eat at in New York City in 1890s were brothels. So it's part of the like range of sensual and sensory experiences offered by the brothel, which is like not just sex, right? It is about the luxury of the furnishings. And we have that association in our mind from the movies. Like you go into a brothel and it's like velvet and, lampshades and music.
Wild West or whatever, yeah, exactly.
Right? But like this is a multi-sensory experience. It's similar in a lot of ways to the restaurant. So sights and sounds and smells and food, like high-end food, like gourmet French food at like high-end brothels is a recurring theme. throughout like US history in the 20th century as well. So this does not end with the 19th century. But this is why you were asking about like the differing rules in terms of gender and eating out and restaurants. So because of this association between sex work and the restaurant really becomes a disreputable place for middle class, white, respectable women to eat at in the 19th century. And they often will not. Like sometimes they will if they're like on tour in Paris and they feel like they have an excuse, in the same way like people will do things in, you know, New Orleans that they won't do at home in Ohio. And so, but into the 20th century, restaurants are seen as disreputable places for women to eat. Women won't eat in them alone often. A lot of restaurants will exclude women altogether and argue that if they let in single women, they'll be swamped with sex workers. I mean, this is continuing into the like 1980s.
Who else is eating at restaurants? Like, I'm thinking about the lower classes here, the working poor and things like that. Is there a different conception of what a restaurant is for other classes or other races? You know, we talk so much right now about, say, upper class whites and so forth. What about people elsewhere who are like? Does the restaurant always have this negative? How do these things start to change over time, where where restaurants become where families go?
Yeah, so well, in the 20th century, you get a real increase in diversification of the types of restaurants that are available. But like the diner, which is like the, you know, standard kind of like middle class family restaurant, that is really like I mean, so you get early diners pre-World War II, but they still are mostly servicing like working men, factory men. And then the transformation of the diner into a middle class family restaurant where you will find high chairs, right? And like kid menus and all like affordably priced menu items oriented towards kids. That is the post World War II. That is not a pre World War II thing. And you also get the emergence in the 20th century of like automats, cafeterias with the coin and the, you know, so those are considered respectable for women when they first open. So like lots of women office workers, you could go there as women and like, you know, they were not associated initially with like sex or sex work. But any place that becomes heavily populated with women becomes immediately sexually suspect. And that happens again and again. So like the automat does become a place to like pick people up. And that even happens earlier in the mid 19th century with one of the first types of restaurants that opens that is geared towards like respectable women. And that's the ice cream saloon.
What?
So sweets are considered like non-sexual initially, like they're like in opposition to alcohol. So like a restaurant serves alcohol, you get the emergence of these eating places that focus around sweets and light foods and ice cream in particular. And they initially are sort of places where respectable women could go. Cause like you're out, you're working in the city or you're like out for a day of chores in the city or whatever it is, you need to stop somewhere for lunch. And so these places are oriented towards women, but as soon as women come to them in any numbers, then they become like subjects of sexual fascination and like sexual rumor and innuendo. And so like in the book, I talk about these rumors that like this ice cream saloon is just an excuse for a brothel. So like, it's very quick. It's like, you know, 5 years after the invention of this type of restaurant, people are like, oh, that's definitely a place to like fuck women.
You're changing my perception of butter pecan now. So, what about the Poodle Dog? This is a restaurant you talk about. It's in San Francisco, right?
It is, although there are like branches of the Poodle Dog in other places. And I feel like, including in Victoria, BC, which is where I live and work. So I feel like there's so much more to be written about the Poodle Dog. This was a book that I did so much research for, and I had to narrow down what I could actually fit in the book.
I need a Poodle Dog book. I need a Poodle Dog movie. I need a Poodle Dog franchise. Like,
it is, yes, it is awesome. So it's a post-gold rush restaurant in San Francisco that becomes like both incredibly celebrated and incredibly notorious for its association with sex work. So like the men of San Francisco, it's a high-end restaurant, it's a French restaurant. So the men of San Francisco go to the Poodle Dog And there's songs written about it and all sorts of humor about it. Wives complaining about their husbands being out at the Poodle Dog. And eventually it's one of two restaurants, at least in San Francisco, that installs an elevator. So you can like drive your car into the elevator, I think, and it can like lift you up to the top floors where like ground floor is the restaurant and the top floors have private rooms for meeting with your mistress or sex worker or whomever. It moves around a bunch in San Francisco, so it's like it is one place, but it's not always in the same location.
I was fascinated by the story of this thing and the pictures. Did you get a chance to like go and see in person where this place was?
Yeah. I've been to, well, it was in various locations in San Francisco. So yes, I went to graduate school at Berkeley. So I lived in the Bay Area for 7 years. So, and I find myself returning at times. So yes, I've been to like the various locations where the Poodle Dog was. And I know the location where it was in Victoria as well. Like I said, it kind of became like a franchise name. So yeah, I would like to actually do more research about the Poodle Dog.
You were speaking about mugging earlier. Were you at the AHA last year when it was in San Francisco? Did you get a chance to go?
I did. I was.
Because we were right next to the Tenderloin District.
In 2023. No, 2024. January 2024.
Yeah, I was there.
Yeah.
I escorted a lot of people back and forth from the hotel to the restaurants they were going to because it was rough a little bit.
It's rough. Yeah, I find it very depressing in all sorts of ways. So the Tenderloin in San Francisco has really expanded, and it's like right up into Union Square now, which is where the conference was, right? And
yeah, it's like right outside. You would step. Like I remember stepping over human feces.
Exactly, or stepping over humans. I find it incredibly depressing. The juxtaposition of unbelievable like tech bro wealth and complete like immiseration at the street level in San Francisco. I find it very hard to stomach.
Welcome to the United States in 2025. I mean, that's just, and at the same time, like I would walk around, I would get to the pier and walk around and see all of these different things. San Francisco was for me, Rachel, the city I had always longed to visit, but had yet to go to yet. And I was able to finally kind of knock that one. I fell.
Was that your first visit?
I fell head over heels in love with it. Oh, I loved it. I don't know how anyone affords to live there, but the romanticism, the selective romanticism is probably the better word, because it's like, oh my gosh, this is beautiful, the food, the history, so forth, and then you see, like you said, this abject poverty, people really, really struggling. It's difficult.
Yeah, I've gone back there, numerous times. So I lived in the Bay Area, not in San Francisco, but in Berkeley and in like neighboring areas from 1998 to 2005. And then over the last 20 years, I've gone back for research, and I've gone back for conferences, and I've gone back, at times to see friends. And I'm going back there next month. I have a book talk at Omnivore Books, which is a cookbook store in Noe Valley. So I'm super excited about that.
I get to, where am I going? Oh, I'm just going back to Tampa next month, but I'm getting all my Cuban food.
Maybe good weather.
Tampa's a good town. I actually like it a lot.
Yeah. The Gulf of America coast. I love it.
I want to ask about another thing that I've always taken for granted. Well, I don't want to say it like that because then I sound like an asshole. Waitresses, whom I do not take for granted, but the role of waitresses, where does this come from? Because I was like, I just assumed that we're always there.
I want to write so much more about this.
This is so cool.
I waitressed between the age of, sort of like college age. I waitressed in New York City at a range of different restaurants, from like dessert cafes to like really nice bistros. And I know from that experience, the ways in which being a waitress can be parasexual work. So you are flirting with the customer, and you are, I was hired as a waitress as a young woman because I was attractive, right? Like that's how I got good jobs in good restaurants. I was attractive, and I was willing to wear tight clothing, and I, was willing to flirt with customers. But as I was researching this book, I realized like how little scholarship has been done on the waitress, which is insane because it's such a huge, labor sector.
Absolutely.
I mean, it just like it's such an important form, important and ubiquitous form of work. It's crazy to me that more people haven't written about it. So that's, I guess, my bid to anyone who's listening to this podcast is on my list of like projects I would love to do a history of the waitress. But I do some of that in a chapter in the book called Pretty Waiter Girls. And
great title for that chapter.
So, ubiquitously in the beginning of the restaurant, the waiters are always men. They are referred to as garçons. That dates back to the 18th century, like garçon, like, l'addition, s'il vous plaît. So, waiters are always male. You can look at like family-run pubs or inns or taverns in which like daughters and wives would play a role in serving guests. So it's not like women were never in serving roles, and they certainly were. But in restaurants, the waiters were always men. And I trace the transition to the emergence of the waitress. This is like what I found from primary source research. I invite people to prove me wrong. What I think it comes out of is the invention of what are called pretty waiter girl saloons in New York City in the 1850s. And these are music halls where somebody gets the bright idea that when the women who are hired to sing are not performing a song on stage, they could come down into the audience and start running drinks. And a lot of these more high-end ones would also serve sort of nice high-end food, or like, so they're mostly drinking establishments, but they have menus as well, depending on, where they are in the sort of hierarchy. And the idea spreads like wildfire. Again, this is one of these things where like the social change is immediate. It's like they're so popular that all of a sudden there's huge numbers of pretty waiter girl saloons pop up all throughout New York City. And you get these advertisements in the newspaper, one of which I have as an illustration in the book, where they're just advertising like pretty waiter girl saloon, pretty waiter girls, pretty waiter girls, pretty waiter girls, like 100 times in a classified ad. And there's even articles where people are like complaining about the newspapers for printing these words, pretty waiter girls, and encouraging this parasexual work, which it absolutely is from the beginning. Like you could touch waitresses around the waist, maybe they'll sit on your lap, they'll drink with you. The women are acting as like drink solicitors as well. And there's an outcry against these, and you might think the outcry came from like the protectors of public morality or something, but actually a lot of the concern comes from theater owners, because the theater has been the site for sex workers. Like in New York City in the antebellum era, the third tier was a public space for sex workers to gather. And remember, like lights are on throughout, or gas lights are on throughout the performance. Lights don't dim. And so like men would go to theaters, and then during the theater performances, they would go up to the third tier and they would circulate with prostitutes and make dates for later that evening, all very much in public view. And so the pretty waiter girl saloons start attracting all these men who had gone to the theater to meet sex workers. And now they're going to these pretty waiter girl saloons. So the theater owners actually lobby the New York State legislature to ban pretty waiter girl saloons, which it does. Albany bans them, but you can't stick the genie back into the bottle. And this is a highly remunerative and profitable business. So canny waiter girl saloon keepers find ways around this ban, and it spreads all throughout the U.S. And I have a passage in the book where I talk about like all the different cities, and that like I had to stop myself. I have a list of like 30 cities across the U.S. which have pretty waiter girl saloons by like the late 1850s. But they're everywhere. And they're especially in places with lots of men, like, Nevada, like during
shocking
mineral boom rush. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how this book doesn't end up to be 1,000 pages long, because there's so many stories. You had to fill yourself. You're like, oh my gosh.
Hard, and there's so many things. Like I know there was like a big legal dust up in LA in the early 20th century over like women servers in restaurants, and like that didn't make it into the book. And again, I haven't seen anyone do a history of that. And like, I would love to, you need
Please,
to
like
let me out.
Los Angeles history is like post-war LA history is like my soft spot. I've got a
Mm,
stack of books on my nightstand that has nothing to do with the book that I'm writing. That's all about indigenous Florida in the 18th century. I love reading Los Angeles. I am fascinated by this. I
mhm,
want to be a detective in 1948 and have somebody follow me around with a muted trumpet is like my
mhm,
life
mhm.
goal.
Sam
As soon as
Spade.
I can create, yeah, very much so, right? And I want to talk about some dame that did me wrong, like all of these things. I was born in the wrong time, Rachel.
Mhm.
Um, but I wonder about, and I was reading about this as I was reading about Pretty Waiter Girls, about restaurants.
Yes.
I hope I'm phrasing this right. Because I thought like this naturally bled into the rise of Hooters and Twin Peaks and the rest of these spaces.
Yes.
Can we talk about how these come to be part of our social norm? Like because they're overtly selling safe sex.
Well, I would call it again parasexual work. Yeah,
Okay,
the restaurant sector as it is described in like marketing materials of the like food and beverage industry. So so the dressing up waitresses in things like kilts and like ethnic costumes, including Turkish trouserloons, dates back to the mid 19th century. And so it is an ongoing practice. And high, like restaurants that are known for primarily for their female servers, again, is consistent throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. So in the United States, there's the Harvey houses, which are the train depot restaurants where the most, and that's a movie you can watch, is the Harvey Girls movie with Judy Garland and Angela Lansbury. Angela Lansbury
hmm.
plays a madam, and Judy Garland plays a waitress. So like,
Just destroying every. Yeah, go ahead.
there's Harvey House girls who are, the main attractor at the Harvey House restaurants, which is like one of the U.S.'s first restaurant chains. So it's a common story. And then in the 1970s, you get the rise of what is now known as the restaurant sector. That really is what the people in the industry call it. And these are restaurants that are all about marketing the parasexual attentions of the waitresses. So at Hooters, obviously they were given t-shirts and encouraged to like modify them, like to make them into crop tops, and then those like flesh colored tights and booty shorts, and they serve foods that are associated with like masculinity, it's like wings and nachos and burgers or what, and beer. And the reason why I define that as parasexual work rather than sexual work is because the the work of being a waitress at these restaurants is not to sell a specific sex act for money, right? Like, you don't have to sell sex at all. And I am sure the vast majority of waitresses at Hooters or these other chains, they're not sex workers. What they're selling is the like sexual flirtation and the promise and um, spirit of, the possibility that they might go out on a date with you if you flirt with them. So you are permitted and encouraged to flirt with them, and the waitresses are permitted and encouraged to flirt back. But there's no expectation of an actual exchange of, let's say, like a hand job for $100 or something, which doesn't mean that you can't also like moonlight as a sex worker if you're working as a waitress at a restaurant or any other restaurant. And like, when I was a waitress, I got asked out by men all the time. It was just, an absolutely ubiquitous part of my experience. And on occasion I said yes, if I liked them. And
Sure,
most of the
right,
time I said no.
right.
But,
No, no. I think that you're absolutely like this idea of like when you go to the Hooters or the Twin Peaks or the wherever, right? It's the idea. It's that there's like this safe fantasy that, oh yeah, like I'm going here, teehee, but yeah, there's this masculine. I don't go to those places, Rachel, for a very simple reason. Um, they serve Pepsi, so
does haters serve
but
coffee?
they do. They serve
Okay.
Pepsi, and then I've got to default to a Dr Pepper, and I just a man's got to have a code, Rachel.
Yes.
Um,
I have
um,
never been to a Hooters, I'm afraid.
really,
No, but I remember when, because
they've got to have them in Canada.
no, I mean, I moved to Canada in 2009. I can't blame Canada for it because I remember when Hooters spread to New York, I guess. I remember my
Mm.
dad going to one and like being all excited about the existence of Hooters, but like, yeah.
Can I tell you, the food's not good. It's really not good.
No.
That's
Well,
why I
that's
don't
not
go.
why my
I'm
dad
like,
was going, Jason.
oh, I don't know whether to give him a fist bump out of solidarity or it's like, oh, okay.
No, he doesn't care about
Um,
food.
all right, well, that's fine. All right. I love him. I want to ask you though, how does Liz, and maybe that's because this book comes out and her experience comes out a few years ago. People are like, oh, there's a movie you guys were talking about. How does she not become a social media influencer? And here's the big thing where she's out, she's spending all this time abroad, she's eating all of this very exotic food, she's living this frankly exotic life that is not typical of someone who might live in New York and so forth. Can you talk about, because you talk about this in the book, about this social media performance, of the rise of the TikTok and Instagram and social media stars, and how food is sold through there, how they're using food and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, Liz can't be a social media star because there's no social media yet.
Right.
I
Yeah.
can't remember
So
when the
I'm
book
wondering,
came out. Do you remember? Do you have it on you? But
I don't,
Facebook
like, I
is
feel like
like,
she missed it by like a decade or
yeah, because
so.
Facebook's like
Yeah.
the earliest Facebook's like 2004, right?
I was
think it's,
selling mortgages when Facebook hit. Yeah.
yeah, I remember I was pregnant and my younger brother was it. That's how I know what year it was. And my younger brother was an undergraduate at Brown. And so he was like in the early rollout of it when it was
Oh
confined to
man.
Ivy Leagues. And he showed it to me. And I remember laughing my ass off as there was that poke function. And I remember like making
Oh,
him poke all his
right.
friends and just thinking I have a very dirty mind. So I thought it was really funny that I was making him poke his friends. So I think she would have, were the book, had she written the book a decade later. But it's pre social media, really.
Right.
Or,
Yeah.
so, but I do talk about like some food social media and like the ubiquity of like food porn hashtags, for example, on Instagram or on TikTok. I am a reluctant social media user. It might not appear that way at the moment because I have been like making an
We're mutual follows. I've seen your social, but go on.
Well, okay. I was a huge lover of Twitter. So I adored
Same.
I did use Facebook. I went off Facebook in 2016 after the 2016 election because of political objections.
Reasons. Right.
Reasons.
What are those reasons, Rachel?
I had become like a devotee of Twitter. I basically left Twitter the day Musk bought it. It's not that I haven't posted anything since then, but I just was like, I cannot create content for Elon Musk. I feel like that was the right decision. And then with this book coming out, I was like, I gotta be back on social media and making an effort because unfortunately, like, people can't read your book if you don't let them know it exists. So I have been trying, and I do now use Blue Sky, which is owned by its own programming staff, right? I know it was started by Jack Dorsey, but it no longer is a billionaire-owned concern. So, okay, those are my caveats. And I've never used TikTok. I mean, like I've seen it. Like I am not living under a rock, but like I've never had a TikTok account. But I do talk in the book about like the use of like the popularity of like food porn hashtags and other things like that on TikTok. But so I think, this culture is very much with us. I actually had a really interesting conversation just recently with someone who was telling me that there's this meme about food TikTok, which I was unaware of, that like the male cooks of food TikTok are like very sexually suggestive. She said there's all these like dudes who are like shirtless and all they're cooking are phallic foods. Like,
Rachel, I was thinking about this the other day as I was posting my own food. I was like, this would help if I were hot. Like quite literally, that would
everything is made easier by being hot.
I
I tell my
know.
students this, they don't want to believe me.
It's true though, because I feel like there's an overt sexuality, and you talk about Padma Lakshmi
Yes.
in the book,
Yeah.
who I adore because I think she's actually wonderful.
Yeah.
Like she comes across great, but also hot.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
there's that, right? And like I can't help but notice that there's a person I follow, Anna Sophia Wren.
This is on TikTok.
She's on Facebook, or excuse me, on Instagram and TikTok,
Okay.
right? I'll send you a link. But like, beautiful young woman, makes really engaging food,
Mm-hmm.
but she's gorgeous. And there's always the promise of sexuality to go with all of this food, right? I mean,
Yeah.
feels that way. I
Yeah.
don't know. That's a pickup. All right, I want to ask you: are there parts of this film that drive you nuts?
The film that drive me nuts.
Yes, of the movie itself.
Yes. Okay. First, I'm going to talk about just a minor technical complaint. In the beginning of the movie, she is seen leaving her New York City apartment with a single bag.
Mm-hmm.
And yet she has a new outfit in every scene of the movie. And,
Okay.
and she's supposed, so like, I don't know where all these clothes come from. And I think it might be like Mary Poppins's suitcase, you know? Or
It's just a
maybe,
dragon's back where you bring the thing. Yeah, it's
yeah,
all
like
the things.
maybe like the tents in Harry Potter. Like there
Mm.
is like an infinite amount of volume, I think, in this suitcase because she just like has like a new outfit for every scene and is always like the perfect outfit for the occasion. And as someone who has traveled like fairly extensively with a small suitcase, this has never been my experience. I never have the right clothes and I'm wearing the same shirt over and over again. So this this did trouble me. I think on like a more serious critique for me of the film, and but it's not a critique of the film; it's a critique of the book. Is that um, the initial premise is that she is trying to learn how to be a human outside of her relationship to a man, and the character says, like, I always lose myself in relationships. I've never been single. It's like I become the man I'm with. I have no boundaries. I'm totally porous and I'm going to like, and I'm unhappy and I'm going to like separate myself from my marriage and I'm going to separate myself from this subsequent unhappy relationship. And I'm going to like figure out like who I am. And you're sort of on this journey. She's like just rediscovering her appetites and sort of embracing being alone when she's in Italy and making friendships. And then she's in the ashram in India. And again, this is like a celibate lifestyle. Clearly, like she's not. And then she goes to Bali and then she's like, oh, I met a new man and I am like, the movie ends with her like renouncing her agency again in a way I find super troubling. So like she has this breakup scene with Javier Bardem, who is like obviously super handsome and I get it, but he springs this trip on her where he's like, I've arranged for us to go away for a few days. And he hasn't asked her about it. He's just like led her down to this boat launch. And she's like, no, I am not ready to do that. And then he emotionally manipulates her and tells her how it's all because she's like scared of love and like she just can't, give herself over to it. And she kind of runs away. And then the movie ends with her being like, he's right. I was just scared of love. And she like runs to like, she's like, meet me at the boat launch. And they go away together. And I mean, my feeling is like, no, like actually it's a totally legitimate thing to want to be like your own human being, making your own decisions and maybe not just like uh, being told you're going away for like 3 days without like being consulted about whether, that is really what you want. And when she like goes for Javier Bardem at the end of the movie, it's like they get together and then she's like, oh, I haven't left his site for 2 weeks. And I guess there's a part of me that's like, actually, that's not healthy. Like maybe you should like keep being your own human and like figure out how to like integrate this romantic relationship into also still maintaining your own sense of boundaries. So I think that the movie and the book both frame that relationship as like a deserved happy ending, but I found it like concerning and like a letdown. Not that she shouldn't find love, but just that she should sort of be like, oh, right, never mind. I am going to totally abandon my autonomy and independence as a human being. And it could be that I am back reading from my knowledge of the fact that Liz Gilbert's marriage to that figure did not work out. And
Right.
after the divorce, she was like, actually, he was quite emotionally manipulative. But
Well, I mean, it's right there on the beach, right? I mean,
yeah,
so
yeah, exactly. That's how I read it. He's like, he really like browbeats her in a way that I found like creepy.
apparently he's got the sad story and he's ready to move on with his life. He's like,
Yes,
okay, I'm ready, but you also have to be ready now too. Like
yes,
you need to be on my timeline. I'm ready now.
yes. And
And
he's had 10 years and she has
yeah,
not. And she's still on
right.
this journey. And he's like, yeah, now it's over. And she's like, yeah, I guess it is.
I have to tell you though, I was texting this. I'm on a chat group with 3 women,
Mhm.
and we are talking about this film, and all 3 of them were like, Javier Bardem. I was like, all right, that's fine. He needs his own. That's fine.
No,
I didn't
I'm
see it.
unsatisfied by it. I take issue with your chat group. I'm sorry, but like I don't care how handsome he is. I I still think it would have been a happier ending if she had managed to like maintain some autonomy and like sense of self and not like just be like, oh, never mind. Actually, I do want to completely lose myself in this new relationship.
I hate to be this way, right? But I wonder about the idea about Liz's experience. You know, how much of this, is she's going through here? Is this an appreciation for other cultures? Is this appropriation? Is it at times to me it felt, Rachel, like it was almost superficial, her dabbling
Yes.
in this stuff. I mean, is that
Yes.
bad? I don't know. She was giving a taste test, I guess, last for lack of a better explanation,
I
of
think
these
this
other
is also
places.
a completely legitimate critique of both the book and the movie, right? And the like exoticization of these cultures that she lands in. And but I read that as like in part like I see her as sort of like cluelessly solipsistic, but I see that as like intentional on the part of the author and the way that Julia Roberts played it. Like that's what I mean about like I kind of like having a flawed character. She is
Mm-hmm.
super unself-aware and she's super I don't know like I feel like arguments about cultural appropriation are really low hanging fruit and like I'm not even gonna bother. But like on a sort of character level, she relates to other people for like the purpose they serve her, right? Like they're like
Mm-hmm. She's
total
a user.
she's a user and she is also like incredibly charming and incredibly able to make connections with people, which I respect. And that's like, I'm nowhere near as good at that. Like, I'm not sure if I don't think if I went to an ashram in India for 4 months that I'd form such intimacies with a young woman I was scrubbing the floors with, or like, a guy who's very unlike me who's at the ashram too. Like, I respect the fact that she's like so open, but also she's like people serve it like people appear as like what they represent to her and how she uses them. But I think that's self-conscious because like in that first in like an early scene in New York, she's talking to her agent and her agent is um you know kind of trying to discourage her from going on this trip. And she talks about like, how much support Liz has among her friends in New York. And Liz is like, yeah, but do I ever support you? I don't, right? Like, so I think she's kind of aware of the fact that like she uses other human beings. So yeah,
No,
she's a flawed character.
she is right, and like, why not go experience these things? You know,
Yeah. I mean, it would be nice if she were a little bit more self-aware about like her.
she's human. Or maybe she's just a New Yorker, Rachel. Maybe it's that. I'm kidding. All
Not
right, let me ask you
originally.
this. All right.
I think she moves to New York. I think
Does she?
she's
Okay. All right. All right. We were talking, you were like, don't tell anybody that I haven't seen Pretty Woman.
You're gonna
So
shame me.
a little bit, it's a little Gen X love. You and I are both tail end of X. Do you have other favorite food scenes in film?
Oh, I mean, there's so many good ones. Yeah, so I talk about the Alan Bates scene in the from Women in Love from 1969. When he is there. The scene is set at this verdant picnic table in the English countryside, and he's eating a fig and pronouncing to the people at the table the sexual qualities of the fig. And it's actually the monologue is straight out of D.H. Lawrence, word for word, out of a poem he wrote. Like the movie's an adaptation of a D.H. Lawrence novel. but it's incredibly erotic. And, I grew up watching, I didn't grow up watching Pretty Women. I don't know why. But I did watch Tampopo and, some of these other wonderful, food and sex movies of the 1980s. And I talk about some of these films in the book. And I should say, in defense of Eat, Pray, Love, the Italian food looks amazing. It was good. I was like, oh, this is good. I want to eat all of these things, and they look awesome.
Yeah, I was in my favorite food. I cook a lot of Cuban stuff, but actually my favorite dish to make is actually bucatini alla matriciana.
Okay.
That is my go-to. If I get the pancetta or the guanciale, or my local Italian market's closed today, I can't go. But that's what I would be making.
The pasta looks excellent. The scene with the spaghetti. Yeah. You're like, this looks really good.
All right, I have two last questions for you then. One, what are you making for dinner tonight?
Oh, I actually already cooked it. Because I am doing a swing dance class, and it ends at 8, and then I have to come home and eat. I don't want to eat before.
That's why you had to reschedule? Because you got I am so jealous of you right now.
Sorry.
No. Can I tell you? So I was working at Walt Disney World in '98, back during the big swing dance revival, and all the dudes would come through, Cherry Poppin' Daddy and Big Bad Voodoo Daddy and all those guys. I was swing dancing 6 years ago. 27 years ago. During that, is it swing dancing back?
We're old. There is a swing dancing culture in Victoria, and it's so lovely. There's a Friday night social called Red Hot Swing. They have a live band. There's a different band, they have 4 different bands or something in rotation, and one of them, the band leader, is 96, I think. So he played this music when it came out, and he's
Gen X as well.
Yeah, exactly. We are that old. You pay $15 and you get 2 hours of dancing. It's not I love it. It's in a dance school or whatever. There's maybe 100 people. So there's no booze. It's just water. It's not a pickup scene. And it's very Victoria. So it's all gender, all sexuality, everybody from 20-year-olds to 80-year-olds, everybody wearing from hiking boots and the Lululemon to people dressed in circle skirts and, capris or whatever. It's just fun. So I went once to the open night and had a great time, and they give you a free hour lesson. And then I wanted to improve and know more. So now I'm doing a class, which is just, I love dancing. I love joyful movement. It's so much fun. I mean, it's just lighthearted. It's low. It's cool. But so I made a red lentil and chicken soup with lots of herbs in it. It's quite delicious. I had it for dinner last night too. It had ginger and chili pepper and cumin and turmeric. And then at the end, I tossed in a cup of chopped parsley and dill and mint, and then top it with a lemon yogurt. It's pretty tasty. And I had it with some brown toasted rye bread.
My Instagram cannot compete with that. I'm thinking maybe I'll make potato soup again tonight because it's 12 degrees here in Colorado today.
Well, I recommend this chicken and lentil soup. It was inspired by a recipe in, I don't know, I think the Times. It was good. I zhuzhed it up to use it.
Okay, fair enough. All right, good. All right, last question. Is Eat, Pray, Love a history movie?
I don't know what that means.
Me either.
Okay.
I was asking.
It now captures a historical moment of when you could do this without being an Instagram star.
Right. We can still judge people after the fact, though.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think it is increasingly capturing a moment in time. It will become historical.
Yeah. Well, it's her life, right? So I guess it's what people are doing. People are still doing this, right? People are still going on. I went to Prague a couple of years ago after a breakup and was like, oh my God, I did an Eat, Pray, Love, didn't I? Because I went to Prague for 8 days and was eating and drinking and just experiencing the city.
I went on a trip to Central Asia for 3 weeks and came home and ended my marriage, as did one of the other 6 people on that trip. So I'm not related.
Just put that out there.
Anything that happened between the two of us.
For the record, everybody, you can go on vacation without breaking up. You can. That's a thing you can do.
One can, but in my case and in Jeff's case, I think the trip did end up leading to. I mean, And like you, I am very good friends with my ex-husband. So this is, sometimes things just play their course.
Indeed. So, Rachel, I freaking loved your book. Loved it. I wasn't kidding when I was like posting on it on Blue Sky and the other social media platforms, because otherwise I'll just like, yeah, I read a book. It was nice. This is really, really good. And so thank you for writing it. I really enjoyed reading it. I loved talking to you today. This was such a blast.
Absolutely my pleasure. And I think, as I say in the closing pages of that book, what I'm really hoping to get out of this book is invitations to good meals and possibly dates. So anybody who's enjoyed this podcast, just think about feeding me.
HATM is big in Victoria. I'm just saying.
And I already have invitations here. I'm hoping that
Okay.
people will bring me places and feed me.
Oh, okay. All right, cool. Because what this podcast could turn into is people come on hey, I will interview you about your book, but also what are you looking for in somebody in Saskatchewan or Georgia or some other place?
I mean, the food is good. I've actually never been to Saskatchewan, but I'm just looking for you can't make money off of writing books, so I'm not really looking for a whole lot of royalties, but I feel like if I got paid in good food, I'd be a very happy woman. So just putting it out there. I'm manifesting my hopes.
Awesome. And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you so very much to our guest, Rachel Hope Cleves, for coming in and talking to us today about this film, about her amazing, amazing book that you should absolutely rush out and read. I'm going to put links in the show notes and elsewhere on social media so you can find it. It's called Lustful Appetites, An Intimate History of Good Food and Wicked Sex. Thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show run and operate. Fletcher, I owe you dinner, but not the sexy kind. And of course, thank you to all of you for continuing to share and support HATM. If you want to do so, you can visit our patreon.com page, patreon.com/historians of the movies. We've got a bunch of early access that you can get hold of. But the biggest thing you can do is continue to share this podcast. Give us a ranking on Apple, a good one, and can keep coming back. So guys, thank you so very much. It's been a pleasure. See you next time.